The Incredible Shrinking Man was written by Richard Matheson, and it was first published in 1956. Now, you probably recognize Richard Matheson. He was a very influential writer in his time. He wrote several episodes of The Twilight Zone, and many of his books were made into films. I think most notably would be his book, I Am Legend. They made several movies of that. The first one, starring Vincent Price, it was called The Last Man on Earth. Then a few years later, they made another version of it called The Omega Man, starring Charlton Heston. And then more recently, they did a version with Will Smith, and it was titled after the book, this time, I Am Legend. So he's been a very active writer for many years. But today, I'd like to talk about his book, The Incredible Shrinking Man. Now, the interesting thing about this book is it was originally titled The Shrinking Man. But then a year later, in 1957, they made a film version, and that was called The Incredible Shrinking Man. So later releases of the book were retitled to coincide with the movie, and so you'll see prints out there that title it The Incredible Shrinking Man. So that's the one I have here, so that's what I'll talk about today. Basically, the plot is about a young man. His name is Scott Carey, and he's a family man. He's got a wife, he's got a 5-year-old daughter, and he's doing his best to live the American dream. And so one day he's out on vacation, and he's on the deck of a boat, and he's by himself. Everybody else is down below, and this radioactive cloud washes over him and gets radioactive particles all over him. Okay, so you can probably tell from a 1950s story, it's probably not good to get radioactive particles on you. Something pretty unpleasant is probably going to go down for you. From that, he starts to, as the title suggests, shrink. And that's where the story mainly deals with. One thing I'd like to talk about is Matheson's structure of this book, because he does it in quite a unique way. So the first chapter is basically what I said. It's about Scott, and he's on this boat, and he gets radioactive particles on him, and you think, okay, this is going to be the beginning of the shrinking process. But then in chapter 2, it jumps forward in time, and Scott is about an inch tall, and he's stranded in a basement somehow. We don't know how he got there, and he's basically being attacked by a giant spider, and he's fighting for his life. And that's in chapter 2. And so as I was reading this, I was thinking, wow, we went from him getting the radioactive stuff on him, and now he's an inch tall, and he's running around in the basement trying to avoid this spider that wants to eat him. What's this? This is an interesting take on it. So I kept reading, and what I discovered was that Matheson does this interesting thing where he jumps different time periods through chapters. So what you'll do is you'll get a chapter set in the basement where he's trying to survive and go through that hardship. Then the next chapter will go back in time, and it'll show the beginning of the shrinking process and how he was dealing with that. And this is where he's with his wife, and he's with his kid, and he's trying to go to doctors and figure out what's happening to him, and you get that side of the story. Then the next chapter jumps back to the survival stuff in the basement, and then when that chapter's done, he goes back to another segment of him shrinking with his family, and you get that side of the story. And it's really interesting take on it, I think, because the basement stuff gives us the fight for survival, the action, the horror stuff. But the things in the point of view of him with his family as he's going from 6 foot tall all the way down to different sizes heading toward the being 1 inch tall, we get the inner turmoil of that. We get to see how that's affecting him as a character. So we get the character-driven turmoil. How do I deal with this stuff in those? And then we get to cut back to the more survival story aspects of the basement part. And I really enjoyed that. So the main theme, I think, here of this story is how Scott deals with the fact that he's shrinking, he's losing his stature, he's being stripped away of his humanity, and how that takes a toll on him. It affects him very deeply and emotionally, and we get to see that happen, and that's a really interesting progression. And basically, it's about how does he find hope in this situation. He eventually comes to learn that he's going to keep shrinking, and we see that from chapter 2. He's already 1 inch tall, so we know right off the bat that the shrinking process isn't going to stop. And so as he comes to realize that, the idea is, how does he find hope in that? How does he decide that he's going to continue on and still keep his humanity and have a life and a future, even though this terrible thing is happening to him, and he continues to shrink and there's no stopping it? And that's really the point of the story, and that's where a lot of the heart and soul of it is, and I really enjoyed that. So again, the story is The Incredible Shrinking Man by Richard Matheson. Now, even though this was written over 60 years ago, it's very accessible to today's audiences. I think it holds up very well. It is a fast-paced read. It is an enjoyable read, and I do highly recommend it. So again, thank you for tuning in today, and until the next time, have a good one.